Angry towns boil over at banking elitists, and the second Battle of Brisbane rages over Australian sovereignty. Coming up on today's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 17th of August 2023. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today, Citizens Party Research Director Robert Barwick. Welcome.
Thanks, Elisa.
On today's show, we're going to be talking about the hearings of the parliamentary inquiry into regional banking closures in Western Australia.
The explosive hearings.
Which you've just attended.
Yep.
And then we're going to talk about the second Battle of Brisbane, which refers to, well, we'll explain that later, stay tuned, but we're going to be talking about the ALP National Conference, which started today. Big things coming out of that too. Now, don't forget, if you would like to help share the word, get the word around, there's a number of things that you can do, such as hitting the like button, making a comment below. Share this as widely as you can through social media, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the notifications bell, and we'll keep you posted of new shows and new content coming up. And you can also find the link below to donate to the cause and help all of our campaigns, all the travel that Robbie's been doing and so forth.
Just on that, Craig and I talked about this last week because going to Western Australia, we're on row 50, so back at the back of the plane, so I'm not exactly travelling first class. However, these campaigns are really taking off, and so, I hate to travel, but you end up having to do it, and travelled more last year than ever have, and so the travel bill for things like hire cars and all that sort of stuff, Craig was giving us an accounting this morning, has really exploded, right? So, and I'm going to tell you a bit more in a minute because there's a lot more coming in terms of the way these things are snowballing. So anyway, any help from you that we can get is greatly appreciated because this is actually going somewhere, what we're talking about. Yeah, and all those are markers and good signs of the traction that we're actually getting through our campaigns. For the sake of the audience, would I travel unless I absolutely had to? No. That's right.
If you can get out of it, you will. And many other things. I won't go through the list. Okay, on to our first topic. Angry towns boil over at banking elitists. So the regional banking closure inquiry has, made some really important yards from Sale through the hearings in Queensland towns such as Ingham and I forget the other one. Cloncurry. And they've now been in Western Australia with hearings that took place in both Carnamah and Beverley, so north of Perth and east of Perth. Everyone's saying, where's Carnamah? Look it up. Yeah, so that's, a couple of hours north of Perth? 3 hours north, yeah. Okay. Doesn't seem like a lot, but it's not like, WA is not like, say, Queensland. It's 3 hours north of Perth. It's a very sparsely populated state, actually. It's 3 hours north of Perth. You're in the regions going an hour or so. Yeah. But anyway, you told the story, just reflecting on these hearings, about how the inquiry came about, and the Shire CEO from Carnamah had a bit to do with that December last year, if you want to recount that. Well, this is a big process, what this inquiry has started. It's actually a sleeper issue. In other words, it was an issue that was always there, just not being talked about very much, except by a few voices. But by getting the inquiry up, it's exploded. Once people got to have their say, they don't say it, they yell it. Right? This has been severely disruptive for the regional economies of Australia and for a lot more than that. And of course, it's related to other bigger issues like the war on cash and whatever. But what's instructive about Carnamah is Rob Paul, who's the CEO there, he decided to take up the fight for his town, and it happened. He triggered the first proper press coverage of this bank closures issue, and it was December 19 last year on ABC 7:30. But the way that came about is so quirky. But like
and I love this story because the consequence of that ABC 7:30 story set in train a whole heap of press coverage. They just snowballed and snowballed. And once the politicians saw the media coverage, apart from the ones who were championing this from the beginning, like Gerard Rennick, who got the inquiry up ultimately, but to get the support from the rest of them, it's the media coverage that convinced them. Because that's what they're like. They're like moths to a flame, right? If there's media coverage, it's an issue. So he triggered that. How did he trigger it? He's at home one night with his wife watching ABC 7:30, and they're talking about some story, and he's getting angry because there's some story that Rob considered silly. And he said angrily to his wife, "Why are they covering this? Carnama losing its Westpac Bank is a more important story than this." And his wife said, "Well, why don't you tell them that?" So he did. He emailed off a furious email to ABC 7:30 that night, went to bed and forgot about it. The next day, he gets a reply, and it's ABC. "We'd like to do a story on your town." And it's like, oh, really? You're taking this seriously? Oh, okay. And so and if you go back and look at that story, and in fact, Mr. Producer, let's insert some clips from that. And the reason we haven't planned this with the producer, but we can insert some clips from that story because the people in these clips are the people who are at the hearing I attended, right? So you'll get to see some of them. But we were over here in the East fighting, and I and Dale Webster and Martin North were working with the CEOs of Coober Pedy Council and Junee Council in New South Wales, fighting really hard. And the James Davis at Junee was doing a brilliant job to try and save their Commonwealth Bank. And we heard about this media coverage. I think Dale Webster found out about it. So we were able to connect Carnama to Junee. Junee also featured in the story. And like I said, that set the whole thing in train. And now because we have this inquiry, it's kicking goals. You know, we know Westpac's had to back down on 8 branches. CBA put on a moratorium on all regional branches for the next 3 years. And none of that would have happened without this inquiry. The inquiry wouldn't have happened without the media coverage. The media coverage wouldn't have happened without Rob Paul.
And it's getting results. It's really great to see some of these Shire councillors and so forth. They're sort of people that would be loath to really get involved in federal politics a lot of the time, and who isn't really, because you don't think you can really get anywhere, make any inroads. However, some of these councils are now saying to us, boy, we should have taken up this fight years ago.
And Rob Paul said that. He, as a CEO, he gets to go around and represent organise different councils. Banks have been closing for years. His view was, most of the time the councils decide, well, that's not our business.
Yeah.
But now the survival of the town is at stake. He said it should have been our business all along. And he sees by actually taking the leadership up on behalf of the town, advocating for the town, they can make an impact, right? And so all this is coming together at once.
Yeah, now talking about the survival of the town, we want to get into some of the nitty gritty, and I want you to give some of the stories and anecdotes that came from the peoples of these towns that were very confronting and had a big impact on the senators. And one of the things that, of course, we've impressed to the people involved in this process, to the parliamentarians, is that by taking this up, they have the power. This is the Parliament of Australia. It's vested with power, and they are more powerful than the banks if they decide to exercise that power. And this is something the people are getting a sense of, and they're not about to put down their pitchforks until they get somewhere.
That's right. The evil of neoliberalism that we rail against when it came and took over Australia was this idea that somehow the private sector was separate from the government, and especially the big corporations, government shouldn't tell them what to do, right? Now, everyone's sick of government, but you've got to separate your experience of ridiculous government decisions from the principle of what the government's supposed to do. We're trying to fight for what the government's supposed to be. And what they did, they weren't, the big corporations never worried about the ridiculous bureaucracy that might have stuffed around local people or whatever. They just do not want any government authority over them that would actually make them behave as good citizens with their economic power, right? And the big ones were the banks. So the Parliament has been brainwashed for a couple of generations into thinking we have no right to tell them what to do, right? And so when politicians, when the public go and complain to politicians, what they get from the politicians, most of the time is, it's not our responsibility. You're in the free market, mate, blah, blah, blah.
You're on your own.
Yet the Parliament is the most powerful entity in the country. It makes the laws. It is it, right? So if you can brainwash the people in Parliament to think it's not their responsibility, you've made Parliament powerless. That's what we're trying to change with this, right? No, the Parliament represents the people and must be the ultimate authority. And it's getting the politicians, by seeing what the people are going through, to act and use the power they have. We can bring these banks to heel.
So let's go through some of the examples that came out of Carnama first. So this town is in quite a bind. So what's the situation with what's their banking situation right now, first of all?
None. So
no
they've
banks.
lost. They had it. The Westpac was their last bank, and they lost it in February. And now the only place you can do any form of banking at town is at the post office.
Australia Post.
Right, the licensed post office. But of course, that's bank at post, which is very restricted.
Yes.
And therefore, when you want to do anything else, it's a 230 kilometre round trip to do most normal banking. And can I say, just like there's a lot of most people wouldn't appreciate this. Real impractical stuff, like even though you can go to a post office and confirm your ID for your passport, the most important ID you'll ever have to travel the world with, the banks don't let the post office confirm your ID for your credit card. So it's a simple thing to do, but so a lot of people have to do that to activate their cards, etc., or update signatures on accounts. The banks won't let that happen, and a lot of country towns, there's a lot of volunteerism in country towns to look after the football club and all the other sort of service things they do, right? And volunteers require formal bodies, little budgets. People have to sign, have to be signatories to accounts. None of that can be done at the post office. They've all got to take these trips a long way away to do it.
Now this came, I believe this came out from the testimony of the postmistress, the local postmistress there, and while we're on that topic, she revealed something else rather interesting at the hearing.
So we're advocating a postal bank, right? We're saying the post office should be the agency of a proper bank. And the only thing that we say would not be done at the post office is you could do everything except have your loans approved. You could apply for the loan, but the post person in your town would not be the manager who approves your loan. And that's good for two reasons, because it's a big responsibility to assess loans and whatever, and you don't want to add too much burden to the post people, the people running the loaners of the post office. But also, sometimes the bank manager has to say no, right? And that's bad for you want the post office to be the most popular person in town, the postmistress or postmaster. So that would be done by the bank itself having a regional office or somewhere, right? And that's where the loans would be approved. That's what we're advocating. And we're getting a lot of support, but we're getting some, certain pockets of pushback saying, oh, no, you can't turn post offices into bank, it's too big a deal. Well, the Carnama Post Office for many years was known as a super agency for Bank West. And what Colleen there, the postmistress, revealed is, as a super agency, she did everything that the bank could do, everything except approve loans. She didn't do the manager's job, she did everything else. All full banking services operated through that post office in Carnama. And if that can happen there, and that bank before Bank West closed that model, it wasn't the post office that did it, it was Bank West. If that can happen there, it can happen anywhere.
Now, there were also witnesses such as a 94-year-old man, George Fowler,
I sat
believe.
next to George for the whole day, for the hearing. And George is the guy, you just saw him on the clip from ABC 7:30, right? So George fronted up to have his say. He said, I'm the oldest bugger in town. And you can imagine that as a 94-year-old. And yet he has had to, the bank closed in February, he has had to twice go to the 230 kilometres to the next town. It's a 2-day trip by bus, because you catch the bus, you get there within a couple of hours, but it's 2 days before the bus comes back, right? And people like George, who don't drive, and the other elderly people, that's what they have to do. And for some of them, a bus trip is even too much,
Well,
right?
yeah.
To actually do that stuff.
Yeah, 94. Now, the interesting thing too about some of these towns and regions, and there were reports coming out during the Carnama hearing about other banks that have either closed or cut down their hours in surrounding towns, Northampton, Kelbarry. There was even an article that came out about Tennant Creek, a bit further away, of course, having lost their bank. But these are areas in the middle of economic boom time that are the centre of bringing in most of our country's revenues, and yet these local towns are dying.
Now, what I noticed about Western Australia, and I'd never been north of Perth before, everything was green, really green. And this is, we've gone through an unusual patch, in a sense, in our weather, right, in the last couple of years. And maybe it's drying off a bit now, right? But WA, is, in terms of wheat, has had the two biggest bumper crops in its history in the last 2 years. And there's all this agriculture around Carnama as well. You know, it's on the edge of the wheat belt, I suppose you'd say. Plus you have all this mining, right? Enormous, the money, the value there in these places is enormous. But none of it's reflected in the towns. The towns are withering and dying because nothing is being invested back into them. Now, I heard one little exception, which is now the town of Karratha is starting to actually switch away from the model of fly in, fly out to actually have a proper town because the local council eventually just got sick of it and said to Woodside, you're going to actually be responsible for the town. And so now Woodside Petroleum has this thing where they pay the interest rates, the interest payments on their workers' debts if they move to the town. Right, and Karratha is booming as a result. Whereas up the road at Port Hedland, which probably has more wealth go through Port Hedland than any other town in the world, right? It's the iron ore wealth going through there. There's no investment, and it's a crap heap, right? In this particular case, you get smaller versions of that in towns like Carnama, and they're withering and dying slowly. And one of the things that shocked me in the clip, one of the guys in the pub there is the local accountant. And he took me outside afterwards and was showing me some of the sights of the town. His name's Dwayne. And Dwayne doesn't see his wife and kids because they live in Perth, so the kids can go to school because you can't go to high school in Carnama. And anywhere in that district, when you get to grade 8, you have to go to either boarding school or in his case, what some families do is buy a house in Perth and the partner moves down there, right? That's not good for family life, but there's just nothing there. And so I was actually reduced to tears by the final witness of the day, a local woman who's actually Canadian originally, and when Barb Smallwood's her name, and when I spoke to her afterwards, she'd recently taken a holiday to Canada, and she noticed that all the small towns in Canada still have their banks. And so the question is, what do the bank managers in Canada think about this compared to the bank managers in Australia, right? Because there's a lot of similarities between Australia and Canada. But anyway, she gave this testimony, and I wish I could play it, and we will play it in future episodes.
So those were just a few comments, and now I just want to sort of perhaps provide a slightly different perspective on what bank closures or how a community can, just a bit of a story, I suppose. A bank invests in Carnama as it has identified it as a centre of a substantial grain-growing region that has no bank. The plan is to have 2 tellers, a branch manager and a business account manager. After a successful 2 years, they open a new building on the main street in a style that is reflective of the rich heritage of our region. They have more call centre staff move in who are looking for a country change and want to get away from the urban sprawl that all the centralisation of services has caused. The branch manager's husband is a design and technology teacher and is delighted to see that there are excellent facilities at the school that need to be returned to use. He becomes a vital member of the school staff, and his children are welcomed as new students at the school. The business manager's wife is a music teacher for both primary and secondary, and she is able to get half-time at school, which suits them well as they have a young family and there's childcare that's available. She starts a small school choir and introduces new instruments to the students. The revitalisation of the school staff and programs sees a resurgence of the local and district support. All families, including farm families, are keeping their children here through high school years, and numbers steadily build. The school buses are full, the school canteen reopens. They can open a new account in the bank that's on the main street. The local tradesmen have taken on more apprentices with all the extra work and the availability of young people in our town and the community continues to grow. The young adults start a small local band with the support of the music teacher. The local pub has them in there for a gig each month, which helps their bottom line. The steady reinvestment in the town means that there are now more shops, businesses, perhaps manufacturing, tradespeople, painters, builders, panel beaters, to name a few. The local doctor visits more frequently and has actually relocated to the region rather than travelling up from Perth. Additional health services are becoming available due to the need from the growing community. The Shire builds more units for aged care. The community and sporting clubs thrive, and plans have started to refurbish the rec centre to meet the demand. The local footy team has an abundance of local players, and they win the North Midlands Football League Premiership flag. Speeches are full of thanks and all the local businesses that supported the club during the season. A special mention is made to the bank that identified Carnama as a good place to invest in. As the local band plays, they celebrate late into the night. That is why the availability of services and reinvestment in rural communities across Australia is important.
And it was very, very moving because it reminded me of, on the way over, we watched this movie, this film, The Bank of Dave. And if you haven't watched it, you've got to watch it. The Bank of Dave is about a man in the UK, in the north of UK, Burnley, who is quite a successful businessman, but he ends up lending money, a lot of money to locals, and they always pay him back. And they say, why don't you start a bank? And it's about him trying to start a community bank, the purpose of which is to lend to people in the local area because there's a need, and the big banking system doesn't want to. And it's a big fight to do it, etc. And they actually ended up winning the fight. But it shows you the different intention between what people want banking to be and what the banking elite want banking to be.
And it shows the profitability of banking in the local community because, as you said, there were no defaults. That's what he found, because people had good ideas of things to do to contribute to the town, and they were intent on paying it back, particularly because it was a local who lent it to them.
And the people who ran the banking system in the UK, they're just predators who don't want to, they want to speculate with money. They don't want to do that.
Well, he donated everything to local charities because apart from paying himself and the others a wage, they didn't need all those profits. So it gets ploughed back into the community anyway. So, yeah, that was a reflection in this local community, interestingly.
So I've been telling people ever since we watched it, when we talk about a postal bank, if you've seen the movie Bank of Dave, essentially we want every post office to be a Bank of Dave. But
all at once, all over the country.
All over the country.
Yeah, that would be great. Now, before we get to Beverly, you were also interviewed by 6PR the night before the hearing, I think, or the day of?
Yep, 6PR, Ollie Peterson, which is the biggest commercial radio station in Perth. I think it's the 5th time I've been on with Ollie now. Ollie's really invested in the campaign. I even offered him a better person to interview, but he wanted to interview me because we're sort of become radio buddies on this. And like the media is interested. Channel 7 was there and interviewed me and the senators that were present, including Matt Canavan and Gerard Rennick. The local ABC was there. That reflects the interest. But it's also, again, very important for the politicians. Yeah,
and local papers were obviously reporting on it as well. And I mean, because the local council had publicised the hearings in their newsletter.
Elisa, let me say this. When I literally arrived in town, I went up there with our friend Andrew Fox. Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Foxy, for the ride. Yeah. And I said to Foxy, I've got to get there by 5 o'clock because 6PR wanted to do the interview, but you've got to have phone reception, and between the towns there is none, right? So I said, you've got to get me there by 5 o'clock, and we got lost. we went to this place called New Norcia. The locals will know what I'm talking about. There's some monastery there, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, we got a mud map. I was giving up on Google. Someone wrote us a mud map, but Foxy delivered, got me there just in time. We parked in front of this old building, and it was a beautiful old bank building, and it was the old R&I Bank, Rural and Industries Bank. And this was an institution in Western Australia for many years. It was a public bank that was there to help all the rural industries, right? And it did a very good job. It later became Bank West as a public bank before it got privatised. And so I was able to say to Ollie, the solution is right here. Here's the history of it. We'll put I took some photos in the window, because it's now a gallery. I took some photos in the window.
Yeah, we can put
them
them
up. And you can
up.
see WA's own bank.
Yeah.
Right? Once upon a time, we had these public banks. We're not reinventing the wheel here. What we're
Exactly.
saying is we've gone down the wrong road, like getting lost on the way there. We've gone down the wrong road. Recognise when you're lost, turn around and go back to where the road should have been taking us.
Now, to more of the sparks that started flying at Beverley, because the banks were on the stand. Well, Bank West was on the stand at Beverley, and the senators gave them the rounds of the kitchen, I hear.
They did. Look, and Beverley, everything else about Beverley was very similar to Carnama, and all the time I've been going to WA, I'd never been to Beverley before either. The salt of the earth, these people, and they come and they have their say. But what was different about Beverley was they had a bank there. There was no bank at the Carnama hearing. And this was Bank West. And I'll tell you what, I love the senators on this committee, because when a bank is in front of them, they straighten up and they roll up their sleeves and they go for them, right? In a sort of a semi-polite way, but they give them enough rope to hang themselves. And as they're hanging themselves, these senators are escalating. And so yesterday, Senator Jared Rennick, who is a bank accountant, he was a bank accountant, right? He a top accountant at the Bank of Queensland. He knows banking. And you've got these couple of executives who Australia had a central casting for bankers, and they're taught, for some reason, like they're given a special coat of, Teflon or something, right? And they're taught how to be total a-holes without going red in the face, something like that. So the ones at Westpac and Sale weren't very good at not going red in the face. But, so these guys, the first question was, Bank West is 100% owned by Commonwealth Bank. So, when Commonwealth Bank preemptively responded to this inquiry, because Commonwealth Bank hasn't appeared yet, when they preemptively responded to this inquiry by putting a moratorium on all regional branch closures for the next 3 years, why didn't that apply to Bank West branches in Western Australia? There's 20 Commonwealth Bank regional branches in Western Australia, there's 37 Bank West branches. But the Bank West branches are not covered by the moratorium. And these guys sat there and said, well, we do have plans to close branches. And so it's like, all right, and it's not even apologetic from them. There's not even like, oh, we feel we're forced into this, etc. No, we've got a strategy. They were open. We've got a digital strategy. So then the question of consultation came up. And I kid you not, when they were asked about consultation, the answer was very brazen. Well, our view is there's no need to consult because we wouldn't change our minds anyway. That's what they said in this hearing. And then they're talking about Carnarvon, where the Bank West branch in Carnarvon has closed, right? And Carnarvon's a town of 5,000 people on the coast. So they're talking about the town of Carnarvon, and they said we had to close it because we couldn't get any staff. Hang on, this is a town of 5,000 people. You can't get any staff, and it's from a town of 5,000 people. And, how hard, the question becomes, because I've used this excuse, banks have used this excuse in other places, how hard have you tried? They use the excuse, apparently Westpac also used the excuse in Carnama, and the locals in Carnama say, we didn't see any advertising for bank staff, right? And it's just, what's revealed is their extreme arrogance, just going through the motions, and they do not care a fig about the communities that they're abandoning. But they claim they did. In their words, they said, oh, no. Jared Rennick said, do you have a responsibility to the community? And they said, oh, yes, we have a responsibility to the community. We make sure that we support banking services in the community. How? Oh, they can use Bank at Post. Anyway, so Matt Canavan asked this killer question. He goes, and I wish I could play the audio of this, but anyway, you'll have to take my version of it. Matt said, well, why don't you suggest to us, do you have any suggestions for us about how we can actually solve this problem of maintaining banking services in the regions? And the answer was, crickets. It's like, put the crickets in. That's what it was. And then, well, you know, it's like, no, we haven't thought about anything like that because we're just here going through the motions. You want us to engage with you. We don't want to engage with the town, let alone you. We've got no ideas for you. We're pulling out. Good luck, right? Yeah. Anyway, so when you get that, two things happen. The politicians, good on them, they escalated against that. And like I said, Jared Rennick he put them through the ringer. And that was great. Matt Canavan escalated as well. But when they filed out, the woman from ABC who was there was a sort of shortish young lady, sort of diminutive. Our friend Foxy followed him out as well because he's a Bankwest customer, and Foxy's got a very big commanding presence, a big booming voice. And he said, hey, I want to talk to you about my account because I've just been told, even though, you know, all this money goes through my account to pay my workers, etc. Without any warning, I was told I'm now a Commonwealth Bank customer, not a Bankwest customer, and that's a big feature in WA. It's a policy they've done, just abandoning all their business customers. But the young lady from ABC wanted an interview, and they didn't want to give her one. Foxy said, you should give her an interview. But of course, they're minions. Someone upstairs at Bankwest in Perth has to give them permission to do an interview. You can't just have a normal conversation with anybody, right? And then I talked to the ABC girl just after this, and she pointed out to me, she said their hands were shaking as they came out of this hearing.
Beautiful.
That's exactly the dynamic that's important. Then the biggest impression of the day was when the audience came out from that part of the hearing. That's this boiling over. There was seething anger. The townspeople got to hear the bankers for the first time, and they were furious because they just heard lies, misrepresentations, absolute arrogance, and they realised that these banks that are big banks because these towns have supported them for decades, and the people in these towns have supported them for decades, the people running the banks now do not give a stuff about them. And they send these arrogant suits down to these towns to say that. And mate, that boiling anger is what's going to drive our campaign to success.
And those people, that audience, got a whiff of the alternative because I believe the postmaster from Beverley actually spent half of his speech talking about a public postal bank.
Yep, he cut to the chase, right? There's a solution. He knows he can do it. There's one of the concerns expressed, could post offices handle the extra security if they're going to be, handle the extra cash? Post offices have said to me, listen, we had more cash years ago. No one cared about us then. Now that we're talking about becoming a bank, suddenly all these obstacles are being put up. But his name's John Freegan, and he just said, yep, here's the solution. The post offices become the bank, right? And very, very important testimony for the occasion, because that's the case that we're going to be building and building and building. Because it's the only way you're actually going to get the banks to stop closing down, unless they have competitive pressure. And John Freegan talked about that. They need the competition. They will only stop closing down if they fear they're going to lose their customers to the public bank.
Yeah, now I want to add one of your other reflections on all this, because this situation with regional areas and small towns was 100% foreseen by the former CEO of Australia Post, who was driven out, Christine Holgate. And it's one of the reasons, one, that she fought to make the banks pay for their banking services through Bank at Post to actually, in a commensurate capacity, pay for the costs that those local post offices were incurring. And secondly, why she was all for some form of post office bank.
Well, exactly. Now, there's a protest in Melbourne today at the Australia Post headquarters, which as soon as we finish here, I'm going to go in for it, because Australia Post is closing post offices. And now the two issues, it's like the perfect storm, right? You've got the crisis of bank branches is going to meet the crisis of post offices closing, because the banks are saying to their customers, you can bank at the post office. Well, now the post office may not be there.
Yep.
And we are now, as a political campaign, Elisa, joining the two issues. Excuse me, because there is a solution. The Post Office Bank, the National Post Office People's Bank, is the solution. It will save Australia Post, increase its revenue to not just provide banking services, but to make the post be delivered on time, right? They'll have enough money to do that as well, which, as you know, is an issue. It's an important thing. And it'll be the competition that these banks need. Now, Christine Holgate made a submission to the Australia Post Review that was announced. In fact, the Australia Post Review was announced the same day as the sale hearing on bank branch closures back in March. And Christine Holgate made a submission. Her submission has now been is public on the website. She made a 120-page submission, detailed analysis, financial analysis, market analysis, and she made the point in there that Australia Post should not compare itself to the 5 worst post offices in the world and say we're better than them. They should compare themselves to the 5 best post offices in the world and say, why can't we be like them? And the 5 best provide financial services. That's the point that she makes in her submission. But she's not the CEO of Australia Post anymore. She's the CEO of Team Global Express. She was at the soccer last night because they're sponsoring it, right? She was at the Matildas match. Barracking for the Poms, actually, but we won't hold that against her. Christine is English. Why is she doing this? Because she has more care about Australia Post than the current management. The current Australia Post management submission to this review was 19 pages, mostly pictures. The former CEO put in this detailed analysis of how to save it. The current management put in this ridiculous submission justifying closing down services, right? You see why they got rid of her.
Well, exactly. I was about to say that.
Yep.
That's exactly why they got rid of her, because she would have turned this around, and our campaign to actually have a public bank for Australia, to develop and build Australia and have thriving local communities would be well advanced.
Yep,
so
exactly.
she had to go. And just to remind people, because we showed on last week's show, I believe, the footage from
Brisbane Revere.
Yes, and I also wanted to mention, well, he was the fellow who tried to deposit, well, he did deposit money in an ATM and then his account was blocked, and there is a petition which you can sign, so make sure you add, because there is a time limit on that, your name to his parliamentary petition.
No, definitely do. The link's below. If you haven't done it, sign that parliamentary petition. A parliamentary petition is a little bit complicated. You sign it online and then you get an email to verify your signature, and you've got to do all the steps.
But his petition, apart from it, because it's called the parliamentary petition on Australians' right to banking services, but it does insist in its 9 points that the government must guarantee Australians a banking institution of last resort, which is the public bank. But I also wanted to mention the fact that with the post office situation, the anger is really boiling on that as well, because we did have a couple of hundred people just up the road here at the local Glenroy Post Office, which is being shut down.
We played the video of that last week, that protest. And that's why what's happening today.
Well, it's moved. These people have moved on already to have this big event in Melbourne at the Australia Post headquarters. So it's actually got a lot of impetus behind it, which is good to see. So anyone, if you've heard of your local post office closing down or a local bank, contact your Member of Parliament, contact other people. The community are going to be right behind you.
Very important. Very important. Express your complaint to your local Member of Parliament. If it's a bank branch closing or a post office closing, call them up, email them and say, what are you doing about this? You should support the postal bank.
Now, moving on to our next topic, the second Battle of Brisbane rages over Australian sovereignty. Now, we want to talk about the ALP National Conference taking place as of today in Brisbane. But explain what the headline means first.
Well, the first Battle of Brisbane, Elisa, ironically involved Australia and America then as well. Both battles of Brisbane involved Australia and American. In the case of the first Battle of Brisbane, we were allies, true allies, important allies, and should have been allies. But sometimes the local soldiers have difficulty getting on with each other. And I forget what triggered it. The legend that I've heard, there's probably different versions of it, but the legend that I've heard was Australian soldiers got pretty upset at the Yanks There was some expression about the Yanks. I didn't even look it up. So it was something like they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Anyway, there was this resentment about the American soldier stealing all the local women. So someone might, if you have a different version of it, fine. But it started off as a fist fight in one bar that just spilled over to the whole Fortitude Valley, and half of Brisbane was having the Australians and Americans having a fist fight. And that's called the Battle of Brisbane.
In any case, the Labor Party's national conference is taking place in Brisbane. And of course, it's a phenomenal battleground because, of course, since Paul Keating, a legend in the Labor Party, spoke up against AUKUS and the Australian-American alliance, there's been a huge fight brewing. You've had 40 local ALP branches that have demanded in their local chapters that AUKUS either be dumped or reviewed. The plan was for a number of conference motions to be put up at the national conference. One from the Australian Manufacturers Workers Union, another from the New South Wales State MP, which insists that locking us into AUKUS increases the likelihood of our involvement in a disastrous US-led war in Asia. So they're getting right to the point of the fact that this is jeopardising the future of our nation.
Yep.
There's a movement, a grassroots network that has popped up too, Labor Against War. So they're running big and important campaigns.
It's a grass fire sweeping through the branches, actually, that Paul Keating ignited.
Yeah.
And we'll see what comes to a head.
Defence Minister Richard Marles even had to convene an online meeting on Monday night to try to quell dissent. But you've still had high-level people denouncing the whole effort to suppress it, such as Firefighters Union boss Peter Marshall. Apparently Keating was not invited to the meeting. He certainly was not welcome, and he won't be there, as some headlines declared this week. And
isn't it funny? Sorry, those of us who have always hated Keating until now, when we've got something in common with him. One of the things here's this guy that a lot of Australians hated so much, but of course the Labor Party loved him. He was a legend, and he was a legend. It was more of a legend because of his style, right? No one could put down the opposition like Paul Keating. So he's a legend in the Labor Party. He goes and does something truly potent, potent, and suddenly, let's cut this guy off. But I tell you what, it is a grass fire that's raging through the branches. And if they think, I don't know who comes up with these decisions, but if the people running the Labor Party think that not inviting Keating to the conference in Brisbane is going to suppress this, they're idiots. They're going to fuel it 10 times by doing that, right? It's just, it beggars belief how they think.
Yeah, so we don't have any reports yet, but they'll be flooding out shortly.
But we have a presence there.
Yeah, we do have a presence there.
With the Citizens Party, you'll see us.
We'll put up some photos as well on the screen.
That's right. You won't be able to miss us because we decided a few weeks ago we would turn up with the biggest portrait of Julian Assange that anyone will have. It's 2 by 3 or something, 2 metres by 3 metres or a little bit less. It's going to be huge. And it's just to rub it in Albanese's face.
Yeah.
You are so subservient to the United States government. You cannot get this guy released from prison.
And, what really rubs it in more is that we pulled together a whole series of...
Well, we uncovered the biggest critic of Anthony Albanese in the Labor Party. The guy with the best arguments against Anthony Albanese...
And AUKUS and the alliance.
Exactly. Is Anthony Albanese.
Yeah.
In 2003 and 2002, when Anthony Albanese made speeches against the Iraq War, what he said was bang, spot on. And Anthony Albanese in 2003, Anthony Albanese needs to go back to the future and talk to 2023 Albanese. What did you say?
Absolutely. So we'll just pull out some highlights, but you can find a link below to find some of the more in-depth excerpts of the speeches. These are parliamentary speeches and statements from 2002 to 2003. So they followed, of course, 9/11 and the discussion about launching a war against Iraq. So he was polemicising against how military power won't get you security. Security can be achieved, he said, only by a victory of humane, democratic values, and Australia has nothing to benefit from war, from launching war. He did of course, condemned the evils of the Iraqi regime, but he said, does this justify Australia's support for the new US foreign policy doctrine of preemptive strikes, which would undermine the legitimacy and supremacy of international law? And he went on to describe how it was very clear that Prime Minister John Howard had already made the commitment to support the Bush administration without any debate in the House, without, listening to the weight of popular opinion or anything. Nobody, he said, believes John Howard when he states that no final decision has been made. And furthermore, he discussed the fact that our military personnel and equipment were already in the Gulf and there was no chance that they wouldn't be co-opted into that war. He then described how, he said, I believe we must continue to tell the United States that unilateralism can never be the basis of a satisfactory world model and that preemptive action should not involve the use of military power. And he basically said that the US is undermining its own supposed advancement of democratic institutions if it does not respect the right of elected members to state their views in the Parliament of Australia. Same could be said of the ALP conference taking place right now.
Right.
So
he has become what he attacked.
That's right. And he also, in another speech in 2003 now, and this was actually the day the Iraq war invasion started, 20th of March 2003, he said, look, we all know that the decision for us to be involved in this war was taken many months ago before the pre-deployment of troops unilaterally with no discussion or debate. And then a couple of weeks later, he talked about the subservience of our government to the US and the UK in bringing up a historical example about the testing of nuclear weapons at Maralinga. And he said this was a political decision by a government that was subservient to the British government. And today, with Iraq, there are parallels with the Australian government being once again subservient to the decisions of a foreign power.
There you go. I like 2003 Albanese, and I want him to come back. Let's go find him. If 2003 Albanese spoke to Joe Biden, I think Assange would be out tomorrow. And of course, what's the irony is Albanese saying that before the Iraq War, and the guy who proved that his warnings were correct is Assange, who's now rotting in jail. And Albo says, please let him out. Like, he doesn't even say, please let him out. He says, my view is that enough's enough and this should be brought to an end. And he's hoping that somehow that's heard in the White House. It's not even a direct appeal. It's somehow that's heard in the White House.
Yeah,
that's why we're going to have the big Assange poster there.
Yeah, and just on that Assange factor too, 9 former attorneys general, federal, state and territory, have written to Albanese demanding he press for the release of Assange. So that's another significant thing, and there's more of these things building by the day. It just
shows you how isolated the current government's cabinet is. That it's like they're hostages to the military-industrial complex, the media, which controls it, because everyone else in Australia wants proper action on this, wants proper sovereignty, and these guys are just captive to the power structure that keeps us subservient to this military war machine. Yeah, and just speaking of that perpetuation of that military war machine, we won't have time to go into a lot of detail, but I wanted to mention and point people to 2 articles in our Australian Alert Service publication this week, which if you haven't ever seen one, contact us, we'll send you a complimentary copy, or you can see the links below to subscribe. Melissa Harrison's followed on the article that you, I think, reported on in the show last week on ASPI's allegations of these Chinese bots that are enhancing various campaigns. In this case, she's written about cyber interference in Western elections. Previously, we've talked about how ASPI wants our campaign against the banks to come under the purview of the Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, because apparently that's being amplified as well by the Chinese Communist Party. And also of note, for anyone who hasn't already made their submission into the exposure draft of the Misinformation and Disinformation Bill, those submissions are due this Sunday, the 20th, so make sure you do that. But the other article I just wanted to point to as well was very important on a subject we've been reporting on regularly,
and that is by Tony Kevin, a former diplomat.
And minerals are ripe for the plucking by the United States. And what Tony, a month or so ago, I was with Richard Barden on the show, and we were talking about how this deal between Albanese and Biden for Australia to be designated a domestic supplier to the US defence industry, the concerns were this would give them power over our resources. Tony Kevin has found, in their own words, in fact, this was two Americans wrote for ASPI, their publication, The Strategist, and they said, their ambit claims are they want any investment by the Americans into mines in Australia for this purpose will come with all these strings attached, including telling us who we can trade with, right? Who can co-own these mines and who we can trade with. And this is a big deal. And that is, so the warnings are true. That is exactly what they want. And you've got no confidence in the government, given how sycophantic they're being, that they're going to resist that. So anyway, we'll put the link below to Tony. This was published in Pearls and Irritations. We'll put the link below to that.
And we'll have more to say that in coming weeks.
Yeah.
But that's it for this week. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Elisa. It's all happening. Enjoy the way the campaigns are snowballing, right? That's all due to the viewer, the viewers who are active. You know, when we say make phone calls, send emails, etc., it works. It really does work. So this is really happening. And now I'm thinking I've got to think about where I'm travelling to next. Reluctantly, I like being there. Don't get me wrong. I like being there. I would wish I could teleport to these places. But it's all worth it, and I'll keep you posted on how it develops.
And a special thanks to all those WA supporters that helped in this past week and came along to the meeting and went along to the hearings. That was great.
We had a great meeting with the Atfield Tavern on Sunday. That was exceptional.
Hello
to meet
hello
you
to
all.
everybody.
4 years since the Citizens Party's had an event in Perth.
Hope to be back again much sooner, of course.
Yes, of course.
So thanks very much. Stay tuned and see you next week.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.